everybody, and welcome to Thrive While Loving an Addict. This is host and producer today, Steve Cary, and I'm with KL Wells. And today's episode is about a conversation we've been having, and we decided to record this because we think it's important and relevant. And the topic of this conversation is patterns. And we're going to get really deep into this. And so, KL, I want to start right off the bat with this question about what do you mean when you talk about patterns, patterns of behavior, patterns of thinking, and patterns of thought? Can you
hmm
break that down and really help me understand and the listeners why this is relevant and so important?
mm So we were talking about a story that I'm going to share in just a few minutes. And what I realized when I was going through that experience was that I actually had been running a pattern of relationship based on what I grew up with. And so I grew up with a mom who was addicted to prescription medications. And so I knew that pattern. I know, the hypervigilance that goes with that pattern as a child growing up with somebody, the never knowing what's going to be happening, the okay, how do I plan for if this happens? The how do I be in moments when it's actually good? And there are deeper patterns that get ingrained in us when we're growing up with that. And that's what we know. And so I had, a mindset pattern that I had developed, and I had a behavioral pattern, and I had emotional patterns that went with that. And generally speaking, I just thought that's how it was.
Were you when you talk about that, you're in the moment of now looking back at that time of your life.
hmm
But I'm presuming you had no awareness at that time that you had a pattern. You're just reflecting back that yes, this was a pattern that you were in.
Oh, absolutely. It's all in reflection. However, I will say that when I had my experience with my ex-husband, a number of years ago, it became pretty clear to me in that experience and in the unpacking of that experience through the years after that, that I had stepped into that relationship with him because of the pattern I had with my mom. He was just a very up leveled, more extreme pattern of my mother. But I knew the journey of being with somebody who was an addict in some form or fashion. And I just didn't know when I married him how severe it potentially could get.
Did you know that he was in addiction of any
When
type?
I when I married him, I did not. And it became very clear within 6 weeks of marrying him when he had a post-traumatic stress episode after having poured himself into a half gallon of gin. He started to, have a PTSD experience that involved threatening to commit suicide and kill me in the same situation. The severity of that experience was also an opening for me to start counseling and begin to understand that although I'd never had quite that dramatic or traumatic experience with my mom, I had lesser experiences with my mom that allowed for that to be something that I would, show up for in a relationship.
So if I think about, you know, those situations growing up in the relationship with your mom that you had, and then
hmm
the relationship with your ex-husband, you talk about patterns. Is it fair to say that when you're in a pattern like that, those type of events are somewhat normalized? Like that's how you see the world? Is that what you mean by patterns?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much what I grew up with my mom and my dad enabling my mom, and then my brother becoming an addict, my dad enabling my brother. I mean, yes, I was aware that other families weren't necessarily dealing with what I was dealing with, but still there's a normalization. And in order to survive those kinds of growing ups, so to speak,
Mhm.
you learn how to do a certain dance. And that's the pattern that gets created.
Got it. So, and I'm kind of rephrasing things as I hear them. It's not so much that it's normalized, yet that's part of the equation. But the other part is you've got coping mechanisms and skills that
hmm
you've created for how you deal with those. And
Mm-hmm.
if I can extrapolate even further,
Mm-hmm.
in situations outside of what you went through, but if somebody's in a different pattern where there might be violence involved and things like
Mm-hmm.
that, they develop coping mechanisms, just like you mentioned, hypervigilance and some
Mm-hmm.
survival mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
And that might be normalized, but how they respond to those events in their world, those are those behaviors are the result of those patterns that they're living. Is that correct way to think?
Yes, yes. And let's be really clear. People can choose all different kinds of ways to pattern themselves from thinking and behavior and emotions. That was just the pattern that I adopted, and also I became the good girl. I was the firstborn. I became a really good student. I remember very much thinking, I just need to blend into the wall and not create any waves at all so that I don't have something coming from my mom who had rage issues. And so, great student, athlete, singing, all of those things that from the outside it looked like I was, quote, a successful kid. And I chose that as a way to achieve and hopefully mitigate kind of irritating my mom or making her angry or whatever along those lines, but it also got me out of the house. So it was another pattern of, okay, I need to be out of here as much as possible. So I limited my time at home. So again, another pattern.
At what point in this journey did you start to have an awareness that there's a such a thing as a pattern, even if you didn't know the term, but you described a scenario with your ex-husband
Mm-hmm.
where there was the threat of violence involved. He had
Mm-hmm.
drank a lot, and you had mentioned having some type of realization around that point. So
Mm-hmm.
how did that shift from these are just my skills that I use and now
Right.
having a realization that wow, this is something that I've developed and having a more objective look at it.
Yeah. So I distinctly remember thinking after I got into counseling, right after all this happened with him, that, oh my God, I've kind of married an up level version of my mom. And I didn't know necessarily what that meant in terms of patterning. It was years until better understood how our brains work and how our brains create these patterns so we can survive when we're growing up. And then we just run these patterns. And it's usually at this point, because now I've done decades of research and learning and studying and all of the things that have revealed for me the story that I would tell is that it is part of the human condition. No matter what we grow up with, we create patterns when we're growing up as kids that help us thrive and help us survive and help us navigate whatever it is we're dealing with. And then somewhere in our 30s, it becomes apparent that some of those patterns just don't work for us anymore. And when all this happened with my ex-husband, I was 31. And over the next few years, I did more and more work to begin to recognize, okay, this isn't what I want for my life. So this pattern has to change. And
Okay.
so and so as the decades have gone on, as I would step into a relationship and it would go sideways, I was like, okay, another level of learning, another level of learning. And I was just determined. I set an intention for myself that by the time I leave this planet, I will have up leveled and up leveled and up leveled and gotten better and better and better at choosing an intimate relationship that serves me and works for me at a loving level that I deserve.
And that's really profound. And I want to go back to something. So we will come back to this because I think that's a really profound point, this aspiration that you have and the continued work, because
Mm-hmm.
it extends a message of hope for anybody who's in a relationship that's difficult. But
Mm-hmm.
that is the segue I want to go back to of being in that difficult scenario because you mentioned that you've up leveled into a relationship that's just an up leveled version of your mom. So the patterns that you had already developed
Mm-hmm.
and all the corresponding skills with your spouse at that time, I can imagine that the same skills were being used. If there was any drinking going on, any of this, PTSD stuff, your natural skills and instincts would be to blend into the scenery. Do not create a situation where you're going to be the object of something bad happening. I'm imagining that might have happened in that relationship early on before you started to get that awareness. Is that correct?
Not quite.
Okay.
I had also up leveled some. I'd gotten a counseling degree, a master's degree. So
Hmm.
I knew more because of that experience too. And I had seen a counselor and so on and so forth. So I wasn't kind of capsuled in that time period of growing up.
You had some awareness
I
that
had
was
more awareness. And so I, but I was also then aware that subconsciously I was linked up with a pattern of being in a relationship that had anger running below the surface, and that there was a level of risk and not quite knowing. Now, when this happened with him, I knew enough to know, okay, we have to get counseling. I have to get counseling. This is unacceptable. And I did divorce him, within just shy of 5 years of that marriage, because he was not going to stop the drinking. And so that was kind of his final stake in the sand. Was he had been in counseling the entire time, but that edge of I'm not going to stop drinking, because he was a Vietnam vet who
hmm
carried a lot of trauma. He came from a traumatic childhood, and he wasn't ready to lay down the bottle, which was his coping mechanism, no matter how crazy it made him. And I wasn't willing at that point to continue with somebody who was actively drinking and doing really destructive, traumatic things.
right. Well, objectively, that makes sense. I'm
Mm-hmm.
trying to picture going back in that situation, and as you mentioned earlier, you had developed the skills and awareness to recognize it for what it was, but you had the subconscious pattern going
Mm-hmm.
on. And I
Mm-hmm.
must imagine, like, well, what about people who don't have the education that you had gone through and achieved
Mm-hmm.
some awareness? There's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people who have been in difficult scenarios growing up, and then they get into a relationship and surprise, there are the similar type of
Mm-hmm.
difficulties. So that's the
Mm-hmm.
part where I'm trying to create or trying to explore whether there is like this link. If we're talking about patterns, if you develop these subconscious patterns, that it's likely to follow you as you go through life if you don't recognize them.
And I think it's somewhat of a tricky navigation. And what I would say is, if you're being treated badly or abused, it's time for you to wake up and do some research. I mean, at the time that this post traumatic stress episode happened, it was 1988. And my counselor handed me a pamphlet on PTSD and Vietnam vets. That is all the information at that time that was available. There wasn't the internet to go to. There weren't books about this. There was a freaking pamphlet. And so, and there weren't support groups. So we have so much more information now. We have the internet. We can do so much more research. There are groups now that we can seek out, and whether it's virtual or in person, where we can get the support that we need, that just was not available to me, back in 1988 and 89. And yeah. And so I do think that it takes a recognition on your part to say, this isn't right. This isn't acceptable. I need to learn more. I need to know more. And that doesn't mean just understanding what our spouse is doing and what they're up to. It's the same thing as addiction. It's, what's the pattern I created that I decided to partner up with somebody who runs that pattern of addiction, and to be able to understand ourselves better and choose a different path.
So you brought, I'm glad you made the connection, and I was looking for a way to go to the topic of addiction, and specifically when there's somebody in your life that you love or you're close to who is struggling
Hmm.
with addiction. And I'm thinking about this topic of patterns. And recently we had a conversation where you were talking about boundaries.
Hmm.
And in your case, with your son Sam, how important it was for you to set and create boundaries so you did not continue to enable him. And that's an interesting story on its own. But if you're in a, imagine there's a pattern that one could be in where you're still operating from the point of view that I'm going to fix them.
And which
And that's
happens a
probably a
lot.
strong pattern because I think that's part of like
Hmm.
a pattern of I'm trying to keep my life stable the way it used to
Hmm.
be, or any
Hmm.
version of like I am trying to claim some normalcy in a situation that is all but normal.
Yes. So what I remember thinking early on, love is enough. Um, and I think that a lot of people fall into that category of thinking I can love them out of their violence or out of their abuse or out of their alcoholism or out of their drug addiction. What we tend to, and that's outward facing. And what we tend to forget about is loving ourselves first. And so we're willing to, quote, put up with so many things for them to get well in hopes that they will get well. And that's where the boundary piece comes in. And that's where breaking the pattern piece comes in is with my ex, it was don't touch me like that way. This is what I'm going to do. If you pour yourself into another bottle again, I'm not going to continue to stay if you continue to drink. And with my son, it was different. It's like, it was still like, you don't get to talk to me like that.
Hmm.
and, and by the way, I'm not going to send you money, even if it's $10, because I know what's happening here. And so they're very different scenarios from an emotional trigger perspective, being the spouse of versus being the mother of. And it's all learning and it's all figuring out, okay, getting clear about patterns with your spouse and then patterns with your child and who you're going to be, who you're going to choose to be, how you're going to stand up for yourself because you deserve to be treated with respect. You deserve to be treated with kindness. You deserve to be treated um, as a human.
One thing that you just said, I think cuts through the noise of this a bit, and to me, it makes it really simple. A lot of these, if you're in these situations, it's really easy to think about these external events. When this happens, do this. When that happens,
Mhm.
take this action. And
Mhm.
I think the subtle thing that you mentioned that is really the most important bit is it's not the external changes that you're making, it's the internal ones. And
Mhm.
so having that decision to say, I'm going to love myself, I'm going to do these things for me, take care of
Mhm.
me first, so
Mhm.
that then I can care for other people in a way that could be productive for them. But if I don't take care of me first,
Mhm.
then I'm missing the most important step. And I think that's what I'm getting out of this, that critical decision of loving
Mhm.
yourself and then setting expectations for what that means so you can then act externally with that conviction, that foundation in mind.
Yes, and so if you take what you just said and put it in a pattern, we culturally run a pattern of external focus. That the situation that surrounds us is going to determine how we respond from a thinking perspective, an emotional perspective, and a behavioral perspective. And if we shift the focus to internal values of respect for ourselves, love for ourselves, having a voice, and being solid in who we really are and being the best expression of who we really are, then the world shifts around us instead of us shifting for the world based on the circumstances that surround us.
Yeah, that so there's a lot there. Yet I think I don't want to oversimplify it, but it seems like a massive paradigm shift. But yet, if you make
Mm-hmm.
that fundamental change
Mm-hmm.
in perspective, then everything does change as well. So,
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, right now we're in the throes culturally, globally, as well as in the United States, of trying to figure out like dealing with stress and anxiety, which, the anxiety research is off the charts and suicide is off the charts and all of those things. And that is that us trying to manage the circumstances. It's that external focus
hmm.
and very much in alignment with life is happening to me. And so therefore I should be doing this as a response. And I'm asking us, just because I've lived it, ask how life is actually happening for you. And that opportunity that showed up with my experiences with Steve, that showed up with my experiences with other people that I became in relationship with my son, so on and so forth, really was the continued question of are these experiences serving me so that I can learn to become more conscious, more aware of the patterns that I'm running, the gifts that are embedded in these experiences. And the one that is a standout beyond a shadow of a doubt out of all of that I experienced with Steve, no matter how traumatic it was through that experience that I learned what forgiveness really was.
Tell me more about that.
There were so many things that happened with Steve that, quote, gave me permission to really be angry and hate him to a certain extent. And even after I divorced him and I was raising Sam, it was about 12 years. I carried that anger with me. And it took a toll on me personally.
I can imagine.
And through an experience with Sam and some group work and so on and so forth, I was actually able to lean into a whole day that was totally focused on forgiveness. And the only reason that happened was because of all these experiences that led me to that moment of being able to do that forgiveness work. And I know the moment I was released from being captive to my anger and I was free. And forgiveness was all a part of who I was and how I walked in the world. And we all tend to mess up the notion of forgiveness. Forgiveness is for us. It doesn't excuse any of the behavior or any of the trauma or any of that crap that happened. I forgave because I needed to be free from the anger. I needed to be free from the hate. I needed to be free from all of that. And it was a body experience. It was a soul experience. It was a mental, emotional experience of freedom. I would not have experienced that if it hadn't been for all that stuff with Steve. And that is one of the greatest gifts. And it freed me up to be able to talk to him and still love him at the end of his life and thank him again because I didn't have any attachment to all of that trauma anymore.
One thing I'm taking away from all of this, and it doesn't surprise me at all, but it's so powerful to hear your perspective on this again. It's really easy for me as somebody who's having a conversation with you and I'm interested in the topic and thinking about this to think about it as a skill that you do or you learn and apply
Mm-hmm.
it.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm realizing is, yes, there is a skill, but when we really go back to this idea of patterns, the topic that we started with, and being aware that there is a pattern and yet there's new ones you haven't developed yet. And
Mm-hmm.
if you change your perspective and change your view of how the world is operating and the life is happening for you and not to you. That
Hmm.
shift in perspective is the one thing that starts to unlock
Hmm.
and being able to see it from a different angle. And it's hard to put something like this into words, such a big topic,
Hmm.
into a medium of language. Yet so many people are in relationships or circumstances that are tremendously challenging and difficult, and it's easy to just live in pain. And the if you go through, if you take your story and think about what you went through with Steve, and you talked about I lived with the anger and hate for a very long time, and it took a toll.
Hmm.
And those decisions that came out of that, which was I'm going to live life as if it's happening for me and not to me. So then you're able to let go of that. And
Hmm.
it's not like it's just like I'm going to let go of it and it's done. Like you went through the work to do it,
Hmm.
like really hard work, but then it is gone. And you talked about earlier about this idea of all of your relationships in your life. You have this aspiration
Hmm.
to get the most out of it. And those are my words, but there's more to it. And I guess
Hmm.
what I'm getting to is um, this simple idea of life is happening for you is actually quite profound. And it's so much more beyond that. And words just can't really describe it, but it's a starting point,
Hmm.
and it travels with you, and it can have huge and profound implications. And it sounds like that is exactly what has worked for you,
Hmm.
and it doesn't stop.
No, and so the notion that life is happening for me gives me the opportunity to ask the questions. Okay, what are the gifts, lessons, and opportunities embedded in this experience for me? And I naturally go to that. And so, therefore, because our brains are wired to answer those questions, then our brains are looking for the gifts, opportunities, and lessons embedded in the experience, no matter how horrific it is. And 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 so, and I've had some pretty horrific experiences happen to me, and I've taken all of them through the years now and transformed those experiences into gifts and lessons and opportunities for me to learn to be more empathetic, to learn to respect myself, to learn to love myself, to learn really, because people, you can't really love others, like really love others from a place of genuineness and authenticness until you love yourself. So what does that look like? And so it's all very much tied. And I talk about this a lot with the people that I get to work with, is because if we can lean in to life is working for us. Opportunities are showing up for us. It's the typical hero's journey. Something
Mhm.
really traumatic happens. It opens up an opportunity for us to explore and level up. And as they say, relative to the hero's journey, that's when the adventure begins. And the adventure is an exploration of ourselves. It's not how to change others.
Is it accurate or fair to think about this idea of life is happening for you as a pattern, or is it just the opening to
Mm-hmm.
the set of patterns that develop as a result of thinking that way?
Yes, if you do a reorientation of trying to fix circumstances around you and you orient to who am I going to be in this moment, you are creating new patterns. I mean, that one belief that I very much hold dear and have lived with for a number of decades now of life is happening for me. What are the gifts, lessons, and opportunities embedded in it? That's a pattern that I chose to adopt. And it was very different than the pattern I was running earlier when Steve is doing this to me. He's
Yes,
the ass. He's the ass in this situation. He's the bad guy in this situation. He's the
that's what I
wrong
was thinking.
person.
Yeah,
Yes, in
there's
this
a
situation.
there's
Mm-hmm.
the evil, there's the enemy somewhere who's doing the bad things that are making my life miserable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'm just extrapolating this, but when you have that pattern in your mind,
Mm-hmm.
you're reacting all the time and you don't have control because some malevolent force or evil force or bad forces calling the
Hmm.
shots.
Hmm.
And you just have to, you're coping, you're reacting, you're responding. You have all these survival skills that enable you to navigate that. And
Hmm.
yet, from this conversation, we're talking about shifting into a new pattern of asking, what are the gifts and lessons in this moment and life is
Hmm.
happening for me, then those events don't stop. There's still,
No.
bad
Yeah.
events happening in life,
Hmm.
but you're able to
Yeah.
look at it from a different perspective and say, what is the opportunity in this event that I can
Hmm. Hmm.
benefit from, or I can learn from, or some other gift or outcome that is for me. And
Hmm.
then that changes everything.
Yes. And so let's just take it a little step further, is that actually Steve and Sam became my greatest teachers
I see.
because I was open to the lessons that were embedded in those experiences with them as what am I meant to learn here? What do how do I better understand myself? And again, what is the pattern? Because I could have stayed with he's doing this to me.
Hmm.
And I've had plenty of people say to me, doesn't Sam understand what he's doing to you? And I was like, and it's so foreign to me now because I orient differently. And and so the people that show up that challenge us the absolute most are the opportunity, and they can be our greatest teachers.
Yes, and that becomes really clear to me. And in my mind, when I hear the word greatest, I'm not thinking of the best. I'm thinking about like the most impactful,
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
ones that have the strongest bearing on us.
Hmm.
From that term, great meaning like, huge, negative and positive and powerful. Yet the impact that that experience had on you
Hmm.
transformed you into the person that you are today. And that's a result of having those people in your lives with all of the
Hmm.
consequential things that came with it.
Yes,
Like you
and
probably would not have chosen to go through that, but yet that's how you responded.
yes, I don't know anybody who says, yes, I'll sign up to, be at the other end of a gun. Any of those kinds of things. And yet, what I do know to be true, very much know to be true at this point, is those experiences have propelled me on my own hero's journey. And for the most part, there's not any of my clients that can bring up anything at this point that I haven't personally experienced myself, or I definitely know somebody who has. And so I can hold the space for them in their own trauma, in their own journey, in ways that I think are incredibly powerful. And kind of coming back to what you just said, yes, our greatest teachers are the people that are closest to us because they crack us wide open when something takes place. And so to have the courage to be cracked wide open, to be on the receiving end of such trauma and still love again, still choose to love again, still choose courage to love again, it's a courageous act. And I was just determined enough to choose to step into my own courage to love again and want to continue to love again, love again, love again, because I want to experience loving. I want to experience the expression of being a loving person. And with that comes the possibility of tough things showing up.
Yes. Yeah, because when you open yourself up to that, then and you open yourself to the possibility of getting hurt and having your heart broken and all the
Right.
things that could emerge. Yet
Hmm.
it's what you're saying and what I believe to be true as well is it's all worth it.
Hmm. That's what I believe is I wouldn't change anything in terms of what's happened to me through all the things. And there are some hair-raising things I can, tell stories about. And they were my greatest teachers.
So I'm thinking for somebody who might be listening to this podcast anytime in the future, who's going
Hmm.
through uh, a life-changing scenario, and the most likely ones are the ones we talk about often, which is somebody in your life is struggling with addiction.
Hmm.
What is your message to somebody who may just not believe that these things are possible, or just maybe it's not even they don't believe it, it's just that they're in crisis. It's just so many other demands on them. And you've been there because you've talked about the scenario with your ex-husband and then everything you went through with Sam. So in those moments when life is just seems terrible and there's no room,
Hmm.
what do they need to hear?
I think about those moments that were particularly dark. And I think in those moments, for me, there was a faith. There was also the opportunity to reach out to other people that I seized. As things progressed, and you're not in, quote, the crisis of a moment, you have a little bit more space between that. I'm a big believer in just entertain the idea of the question of shifting it from life is happening to me to actually what if I actually did believe that life was happening for me? If I believed that life was happening for me, what are the gifts, lessons, and opportunities that are open to me that I hadn't entertained at all before because I was so caught up in life's happening to me and I'm just in reactionary mode
Hmm.
and I'm just trying to fix it. And so I'm encouraging people to step back, take a breath, ask a different question.
Yeah, it's almost like you're opening the door a tiny bit to this new possibility that you would never even consider. Uh,
Hmm.
and or not to get too deep about this, but if you are responding in crisis mode and you're trying to fix everything, there's no room to entertain notions like that. So what I hear you suggesting is like just think about what if, and then
Hmm.
it kind of inserts this idea into your mind.
Hmm.
It's almost like to me the movie Inception, where there's an idea that's been implanted, but like what if this could be serving me in some way that I don't know about yet, and it just
Hmm.
plants that little seed
Hmm.
of, and I won't call it doubt because that's not what it is, but it's a different, what if it could be different? And your mind then grabs hold of that and then starts
Yeah.
to think about it even when you're in a different frame of mind. It's just there.
Yes. I think hmm, it's really important to understand that the questions that we ask ourselves are really important to like think about because our brains are trained to answer the question. So if our brain is answering the question, why is this happening to me? It's going to find all reasons as to why it's happening to you.
Right.
Okay. If your brain is answering the question of, how is this serving me? What gifts are embedded in this experience? It's going to, at first, go, what are you talking about? And then, but if you are persistent in asking that question, your brain is going to look for answers. And you just need to hang in there long enough before one answer begins to emerge. And before you know it, once that one answer emerges, then there's another answer. There's another gift. And then it's that shift from bad things, wrong things are happening to me to, oh, this gift showed up. Oh, this gift showed up. Oh, this gift showed up. And you can flip in whatever direction you choose to flip. Then you are at choice.
Yeah. And I think to me that entire message is the most powerful of all this is when you ask a question, your mind is going to find an answer.
Mm-hmm.
And even if like it doesn't
Hmm.
know, wow, this is a new question. I've never thought about it before. And even if it doesn't
Hmm.
know, if you
Hmm.
give it just a tiny bit of space, it's going to find it. And then, as you said, it will find the next and the next and the next one. And that's kind of going back to patterns. You're starting to
Hmm.
develop a new pattern,
Hmm.
and then
Hmm.
you'll start to believe in that pattern, and you'll have all these affirmations of it that it's working. And the reason I want to bring this back up again and ask these type of questions, because when I said earlier, like I like these conversations because I think of it as a skill to be learned. And this isn't a skill. What we just talked about isn't a skill. It's a fundamental shift in how we see the world. And
Yes.
it's a it's an action that we can take that will help shift a perspective. But that's not the same as picking up a book or reading an article or getting a lesson from somebody about
Hmm.
developing a skill.
Hmm.
This is a deeper thing where you ask a challenging question and you rely on your mind to provide an answer. And
Hmm.
yes, there are skills. The skill is coming back to it,
Hmm.
developing some rigor around asking yourself a question. Maybe you do that every day, the first thing in the morning.
Hmm.
Um, and that's a skill to be developed. But this idea of asking a challenging question is deeper than that. And I think it's profound. And that's why I wanted to come back to it.
Yeah, it is a paradigm shift. And if for those of you who have read, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, or if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it, is that book is about a massive paradigm shift in the midst of the Holocaust. And I read that book years ago and I still have it on my shelf. And I hold that example of Viktor Frankl as an aspiration of who I want to be in the world. So there is an intentionality about it for me, and particularly in the times that we're in, is that if he can do what he did in the midst of the Holocaust, which was look for the tiniest of expressions of love, then what can we do?
I think that is probably the best way to close this out. And I don't think there's anything more that I could ask or say that would contribute beyond what you just mentioned. So I'd like to thank you for sharing your stories that
Mhm.
you've gone through and the lessons that you've received out of this, and also just the shared story of what you're doing so that others might find inspiration to do something in their lives that might change the patterns that they're in so they can find joy in the world or bring joy. So anyway, thank
Mhm.
you very much. I think it's been a really good conversation and I appreciate it. It's always wonderful to hear this. I walk away with so much beyond just having an interview.
Yeah, this is the deeper stuff that I think is most important. And, I'm just blessed again to have been on this journey and to be able to have a platform to share my own shifts in my paradigm of thinking and to do my life differently. And it's still a work in progress for me. And I think it always will be until I take my last breath. But this isn't meant, I share this because I want people to begin to grab a hold of something that might entertain the notion of doing it differently in their lives. And whatever that is, take it, focus on it, practice it, run with it. And then there'll be a next. So thanks for doing this with me, Steve.
You are welcome. And
Hmm.
thank you to all of our listeners. And until next time, enjoy the
Thrive.
day.
Hmm.
Thrive.
Thrive.